Thank you, Mr. Watson. Thank you, each of you, for your testimony this morning. And I want to kind of take your comments, Mr. Watson, and kick this over to the Deputy Secretary, Mr. Connor, because I think you have articulated well. We are at a place where our federal government managers have approximately 640 million acres under federal management. That's nearly 30% of the United States of America. That's significant. And I think we would all agree at this dais here that our public lands, our lands in this country, are treasures. And we do have a responsibility, a stewardship responsibility to them. And how we address this is the crux of what we're dealing with here today. But when we were looking through the history of LWCF and recognizing that this was enacted 50 years ago, when the bill was moving through the process, the Senate version of the bill originally had development in it. And it's my understanding that they dropped that in conference because there were some who felt that there was this urgency to acquire lands before either the value skyrocketed or they were privately developed. So then, since that time that we passed LWCF, we've had 104 million acres in Alaska added through ANILCA, nearly 5 million additional acres alone with LWCF. Again, we're about 30% of the United States acreage out here. So the question I think that we're dealing with is, do we keep adding to that land bank without focusing on the responsibility for management and maintenance of what is contained within that bank? At what point, Mr. Connor, should we start taking care of what we already own rather than the continual focus on acquisition? And as Mr. Watson said, reminded us that this is the Land and Water Conservation Fund, not the Land and Water Acquisition Fund. At what point do we say we've got to put a priority on the maintenance in the backlog?
Thank you for the question. I think that is the question we should be asking. Are we merely adding to the federal estate through the Land and Water Conservation Fund, the acquisition side of it? Or what purposes are our acquisitions for? As I mentioned in my testimony, 99.25% of the acquisitions in the last 5 years have been within the exterior boundaries of conservation units. And I think what we are trying to accomplish with respect to that is we're trying to certainly add to the conservation value to connect habitats, but that eases overall management. We're addressing inefficiencies in our management, as I mentioned, with our respect to our inholdings and the fact that drives up fire suppression costs associated with.
Don't you run out of these inholdings that will allow you to have continued efficiency? I understand what you say. I think we're all agreeing here, but at what point do we say we have an obligation, a financial obligation, and a stewardship obligation to care for these lands that we have now under our federal management?
Absolutely, we do. But I don't think the choice is, do we address the deferred maintenance issue within the National Park Service and other land management agencies? Is that a competition with the Land and Water Conservation Fund? I think the Land and Water Conservation Fund improves management, improves our ability to meet state priorities, has a lot of conservation benefits. It's a necessary program to address a lot of needs, both for federal land management agencies, but also for state and local priorities. Deferred maintenance is a very real issue, and I think we share the view that is a serious issue that needs to be addressed. Our budget also does that through a separate mechanism.
How are we proposing then to do that? Because the administration is seeking to turn LWCF into a permanent, mandatory funded program. But how do we do that? So far as I know, we haven't identified any offset, which is an issue here when we're dealing with CBO scoring. How do we ensure that, in fact, we have in place the means to address this, because LWCF is not, it's not a true trust fund here. It's always been subject to appropriations. So you acknowledge that there is a need to address it, but what we haven't seen is how we effectively pay for it.
Well, there are overall in the budget, as we've talked about in our budget hearing, there are offsets in the overall budget for both the mandatory funding request for Land and Water Conservation Fund and the specific initiative we have within the Park Service budget to address the deferred maintenance issue, $243 million in the 16 budget specifically through the discretionary appropriations process to address deferred maintenance issues, plus $300 million in mandatory funding for a 3-year period, each year for a 3-year period to address that deferred issue in association with the National Park Centennial, with our goal is to take those highest priority assets, the $2.2 billion that we've identified as our highest priority non-transportation assets, and get them in good condition over a 10-year period intended to address the deferred maintenance issue. So we have offsets in the overall budget that provide for both the Land and Water Conservation Fund mandatory request and the deferred maintenance issue with the Park Service budget.
But I think we recognize that the identified offsets that you have come up with are probably offsets that will not be acceptable within this Congress. So where do we start?